one source I go to, Middle Eastern news and North Africa, and that is Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com, bookmark it. They're based in Washington, D.C. You get the best analysis from their writers there. They got the best correspondence, I think, on the globe, and you get the best insight, not the typical nonsense you get from a lot of these other foreign journals. You get real, live insight from very experienced, very savvy journalists. Sami Hamdi's with us from the UK. Sami, Happy New Year. Great to have you back, man.
Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed the festive season.
Oh, absolutely, Sami. Your piece that I want to talk about today, it's on Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. Gulf reconciliation, what you need to know. So this kind of went under the radar screen. Everything going on about Trump and the election and, of course, what happened on Wednesday, the Capitol unfortunate incident. It kind of got under the radar screen, but movement in the Gulf on the embargo, the blockade, if you will, and Saudi Arabia allowing now travel back and forth, airspace opening up. But in your piece, I thought it was very insightful. Now we got Jared Kushner involved. For 3 years, he was nowhere to be found on this. And much to my chagrin, because I was not a fan of the embargo when I traveled to that part of the country, and I thought that it was about the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And it caused a humanitarian crisis, and I think the Saudis were going to build some kind of a moat that didn't make it. The whole thing was asinine. Where are we with this now?
I think it's important to highlight that if Trump had won the election, it's unlikely we would have seen a reconciliation. It's important to highlight that the confidence with which the blockading countries thought they would be able to blockade Qatar was built on this general perception that President Trump was amenable to it, whether that's because he wanted to ensure the buy-in of the Gulf allies who are badly disunited, or whether for more personal reasons. There is this popular perception, whether it's true or not, is irrelevant, but the popular perception that Trump had personal grievances towards Qatar from his business days. But with the Biden administration coming in, there are fears in Riyadh, there are fears in Saudi Arabia that perhaps he might not be as lenient on Saudi Arabia as perhaps Trump was. You'll remember, for example, when Khashoggi, the journalist, was murdered, Trump essentially turned a blind eye to it because he believed that U.S. interests depended upon having good relations with Saudi Arabia, and that the Khashoggi was not worth compromising them. We've seen on the war in Yemen, the United States has preferred to turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's role, primarily because the Washington and Saudi, and indeed many in the region, believe that the priority is to prevent Iran from establishing a foothold in northern Yemen through the Houthis. So given the fears of a Biden antagonism, and given that the potential for Qatari media outlets, whether it's Al Jazeera or whether the other Arabic and English outlets, to fuel that antagonism, to fuel Democrat antagonism that may well pursue punitive measures in the Congress against Mohammed bin Salman, there is this bid now from Saudi Arabia to shore up a lot of the contentious issues in order to insulate itself and reduce the opportunities Biden might have to antagonize them. And that's why this reconciliation, it's interesting that you mentioned Saudi and you didn't mention the UAE, you didn't mention Egypt, because that's reflective of what happened, in that this was a unilateral decision from Saudi Arabia.
Right.
There are 4 blockading countries, but it's Saudi that led it and sort of dragged the UAE and Egypt and Bahrain kicking and screaming into a reconciliation they quite frankly didn't want.
Well, look, it's been based on the Saudis from day one. And obviously, it's always been my contention that when the Saudis wouldn't have done this blockade, which, by the way, has had no impact on getting anything they want. If you look at the objective of the blockade, and I think they had 10 demands, and there were 4 countries involved, right? Bahrain, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. They never got any of their demands met. And actually, it backfired on them. They made the Qatari economy stronger, because what the Qatars did is they opened up new ports of entry, they opened up new trade routes, they went around it, their gross national product went up. I mean, so it actually backfired. But what was so disappointing with it is you couldn't fly in their airspace. People that had families in different countries couldn't travel. Students were stuck. If they were in Doha in college and they lived in the UAE, they couldn't go back and forth. The thing was a disaster. And this thing should have gotten resolved ages. I don't even know what they were waiting for. How do you have a blockade? You don't meet any of the objectives. It backfires. It makes the country that got blockaded, Qatar, stronger. And then, like, why is it still on? Like, what is their objective now?
I think it's important to highlight that I know there is this. It's often touted that that it completely failed and that Qatar is the one that emerges the victor. But I do think there should be slightly a bit more nuance with regards to how we assess it. Primarily because none of the 13 demands were intended to be achieved in the first place. Like, for example, the condition with regards to cutting ties with Iran had nothing to do with pressuring Qatar to cut ties with Iran. It was all about trying to get Washington on board to support the blockade. This idea, for example, of Qatar sponsoring terrorism, even Saudi and the UAE don't believe that Qatar is sponsoring terrorism. It was merely to try to push this notion that the Muslim Brotherhood are terrorists, and therefore the UAE's foreign policy in Libya, in Tunisia, in Sudan, in Somalia, where it's really trying to expand its maritime policy. It was all about trying to get international support for the blockade. The primary reason for the blockade was quite simply that Qatar's support for the Arab Spring and Qatar's media coverage was so effective that it threatened the monarchies of the kingdom. So the blockade was about trying to prevent Qatar from continuing to pose this threat. And if we look at it from this angle, the reality is that while the blockade did not achieve the resounding success that perhaps they would have wanted to, when you look at the situation today in the region, Qatar is no longer the major influential power that it was between 2011 and 2015. Its allies are no longer dominant in Tunisia. Its allies are no longer dominant in Egypt. They are no longer dominant in Libya. They are no longer dominant in Sudan. They've been overthrown. They're no longer dominant in Yemen. The reality is that when Saudi Arabia and the UAE are looking at the results of the blockade, the key reason that drove the antagonism in the first place are no longer as potent a threat as they once were. This is not to say that the blockade was a success. It was a failure in that Qatar has emerged stronger, that Qatar has diversified its economy, and that Qatar has more public sympathy as far as Washington and as far as Europe and Africa. However, we should not be led into this perception that there is a winner and that there is a loser, because the reality is that the dynamics that underpin the reconciliation do not suggest that there is a real reconciliation. In the article I alluded that there are some key questions that remain unanswered. Is Al Jazeera going to stop covering Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses? Are they going to stop covering bin Salman's antics? We see today, for example, there's news that has emerged that an Israeli sports team is participating for the first time in Saudi's history in a desert rally, and that they entered with Israeli passports. If there was no reconciliation, Qatar would be up in arms with its media saying, look at this betrayal. But because of this reconciliation deal, Qatar is silent, and it's mainly Saud bin Salman now is trying to push ahead with these various different reforms. And that in itself is a victory. And it's important to highlight this point in that while they didn't secure any of the 13 demands, Saudi secured its most important demand, which is the silence of Qatar's media outlets. Not necessarily because Qatar conceded it, but because Qatar wants to develop good ties with Saudi, so it offered it to ensure that this reconciliation takes place, primarily, of course, because Qatar wants to break the Saudi-UAE alliance. But when we look at success and failure, this most important condition that bin Salman believes has been the biggest thorn in his side, has been the one that has undermined his attempts to revamp the image of the kingdom around the world. This relentless negative media coverage, Qatar have offered it and Saudi Arabia has taken it. So if you're sitting in Riyadh with Mohammed bin Salman, that's a very, very good bargain. And the reason why the UAE and Egypt are so upset is because bin Salman did not lobby for that deal to apply to them as well. Qatari media is lambasting the UAE. They're still putting some pressure on Egypt. And Egypt and UAE are upset in that if Saudi was going to secure such an important condition, why did bin Salman not drag his heels and assert that it should be for the UAE and Egypt? And the reality is that it's because bin Salman was worried about Biden and thought that he should secure this reconciliation at any cost possible. But the long story short, in terms of winners and losers, I don't think it's necessarily as clear-cut as perhaps is often being betrayed.
Brilliant analysis, I have to say, Sami. Sami Hamdi with us. Sami, senior correspondent, Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. This is my one source of information for the Middle East, and Sami is all over this. Sami Hamdi. Sami, so just one thing, Al Jazeera, which is the network, the media network, which is massive in Europe now, Middle East, and certainly North Africa, They have a massive online following, and they're also on the various networks. Well, Al Jazeera, which is actually owned by the Qatari government, well, they claim relentlessly that they're independent of the government. They make their own decisions. I mean, I've been there in their headquarters. I've met with their CEO, and they totally claim total independence. Do you believe that?
I think that, to be honest, Al Jazeera became famous because you have to understand the region. In the region, information is tightly controlled by authoritarian regimes. Al Jazeera was one of the first, alongside Al Mustaqilla and some other channels, the first to bring the other side, the other opinion, opposition opinion. And that's what made it so famous, in that if you were in Tunisia, you were able to hear the opposition view through Al Jazeera, despite the government really trying to crack down on putting opposition in prison. If you were in Egypt, the opposition being in prison, the only way you'd hear their voices is through Al Jazeera. That's how it became especially powerful. But there are rules to the game. The independence is not absolute. Al Jazeera does not cover Qatar's domestic politics or Qatar's abuses inside. Not that I'm saying it's comparable perhaps to the other Gulf states, but for example, there is no criticism of the Qatari government or accountability on Al Jazeera, and that's understandably so. It's the Qatari's media channel. When it comes to foreign policy, for example, if Qatar is trying to pursue good ties with a particular nation, it orders Al Jazeera to be quiet. We saw a few years ago when Al Jazeera's coverage of Kuwait resulted in a deterioration between Kuwait and Qatar. We saw Al Jazeera suddenly ordered to stop its coverage of Kuwait in respect of the Kuwaiti Emir, and Qatar and Kuwait ties healed up. When we look at its relation now with Saudi Arabia, just the day before the reconciliation, we were seeing a lambasting of Saudi Arabia and of bin Salman and of Khashoggi and of corruption and the like. The day after, it was suddenly news about how Riyadh, the capital of Saudi, has become a model of development, and how Saudi Arabia is suddenly becoming this on road an example of modern progress and the like. In other words, there were clear instructions that Al Jazeera should stop criticizing Saudi Arabia. This is not to suggest that it is not a necessary channel for the region or an important channel, or that it's not an outlet for people's views and opposition voices. It is a very important outlet, and it's played a significant role in the promotion of freedom and the like. And but for Al Jazeera, the Arab Spring would not perhaps have reached the magnitude that it eventually reached. But that does not mean that it is entirely independent. At the end of the day, it is a government tool, and I always argue that the difference between the Qataris and perhaps the UAE and the Saudis is that the UAE do not allow any breath of opposition. The mere whiff and you go straight to prison. In Saudi Arabia, they allow a little bit insofar as you do not actually cause any threat to the government. And in Qatar, they allow you to criticize everybody, and they allow you perhaps to openly say, you know, we disagree with this foreign policy issue. But if it in any way influences decision-making or policy in Qatar, then you can be sure that that window of expressing your opinion will be shut down as swiftly as you would see perhaps in the UAE or perhaps in Saudi Arabia. So it's just simply various different degrees, but the essence is the same, in that Al Jazeera allows a window for people to express themselves, but within limits that are, to be quite frank, understandable when you consider what Qatar is trying to achieve in the region.
So Sami Hamdi with us. Sami Hamdi, senior correspondent. He's based in London. He's in the UK, senior correspondent with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com, based in Washington, D.C. Best coverage of the Middle East and North Africa with the most insight you're going to find. I'm really impressed by your analysis here, Sami, I have to say, and I don't impress easily, but it's very insightful. This is why I read InsideArabia.com, to be honest, and that's everybody should do that. So basically, as we said at the beginning of the conversation, the Saudis are driving, Mohammed bin Salman drove the embargo, now they're driving the reconciliation. But your position here is that they cut out their blockade partners, or as they call it in Qatar, I think they call it the siege. They cut out their blockade embargo partners to cut a deal to get favorable coverage from Al Jazeera, stop hammering them. But that same reconciliation in the Al Jazeera media is not extended to Bahrain, Egypt, or the UAE and MBZ. It's a brilliant move by Mohammed bin Salman if he can pull this off. So where does the embargo stand now? I mean, what's the future of it?
I think it's clear that when you look at the statements that are coming out more recently between Qatari analysts and the likes of Anwar Gargash from the UAE, it's clear that the tensions between Qatar and the UAE remain. And it's clear that when you look at some of the Qatari analysts analyzing the reconciliation, it's clear that for many Qataris, they assert this is a bilateral reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and that with regards to the UAE and the like, it's a start, but that much more steps need to be taken. I think when we look at the other countries and how they're dealing with it, I think the way that the UAE and Egypt have tentatively welcomed the reconciliation, I mean, we saw Qatar's finance minister in Cairo. When we look at the way they've tentatively received the reconciliation, it's clear that despite bin Salman unilaterally pursuing this reconciliation, despite this idea that he pulled the carpet from underneath them, they're very unwilling to alienate bin Salman and alienate Saudi Arabia. And I think this poses more a problem for the UAE than it does to Egypt. Egypt primarily because it's in a position whereby it wants to insulate itself from crises, whether that's Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt has this foreign policy attitude of, I really just want to be left alone and I really just want some time to deal with my internal issues, as opposed to the UAE, which is in the midst of really expanding, really trying to assert itself abroad, whether in Yemen or in Libya or in Egypt. It sees itself as this new headquarters of regional power and the like. It is the UAE that will be particularly upset, primarily because the UAE has always seen itself as the prime influencer of Saudi policy and to some extent Egyptian policy. For the dynamics to be flipped, for Saudi Arabia to suddenly turn around and impose itself on the UAE, whether that's in Yemen where it coerced the UAE into forming a united government once more instead of really pushing the idea of separatism, or more recently with regards to reconciliation, poses a real issue for the UAE because suddenly it finds that its options for leveraging against Riyadh at times in which bin Salman is really set on a particular idea have suddenly become limited. And that's why I always argue that normalization of ties with Israel, when UAE normalize ties, the aim is not necessarily just with Qatar or Turkey or the like, but it's also targeted towards Saudi and Egypt with a prospective scenario that should Saudi or Egypt ever decide to turn on the UAE, should they ever decide to flip the dynamics and suddenly reassert themselves as the leaders of the region, the UAE will be able to do what Qatar has done in the past, lean on Tel Aviv, lean on Israel, influence Washington, and get Washington to put Saudi in check and to put Egypt in check as the UAE pursues its own independence. Normalization, for all of the talk about UAE-Saudi being in a firm alliance, normalization of ties with Israel, and this has upset a lot of Saudis when you speak to them behind closed doors, in reality is also designed to ensure that Saudi never again becomes this leader of the region that asserts itself against its smaller neighbors. It no longer becomes that big brother. And that's why I think that when UAE looks at reconciliation, when it looks at what Saudi is doing in Yemen, it will be thinking not necessarily that there is a short or medium-term threat, but that it should always keep this card in its pocket in case bin Salman decides to genuinely see himself as this rising, powerful leader that should assert himself even when it comes at the expense of the UAE's interests.
So the common opinion of many in the U.S. that MBZ is pulling all the strings for MBS, that he's the older, he's more mature. Mohammed bin Salman is intemperate, he's compulsive. That basically you're saying that's flipping now. That MBS, as you know, eventually his uncle dies, that he basically is now asserting his leadership and authority over the region, so that he's not in the shadow of MBZ that many people thought were pulling the strings for a long time. Is that a fair assessment of what I just heard?
I don't think it's to that extent. I think it's more that bin Zayed MBZ is a very shrewd individual. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily that he worries that in the short term suddenly bin Salman is asserting himself. He accepts that this was more done out of a panic by Mohammed bin Salman over Biden than a more calculated attempt perhaps to assert or exert his authority. What the UAE is worried about is that it was unable to convince bin Salman that it shouldn't do reconciliation. It was unable to convince bin Salman that his interests are in keeping the line, are in staying aligned with UAE interests, in ensuring that Qatar remains blockaded. This failure of the UAE to influence bin Salman, who was panicking, is what will concern Abu Dhabi, in that if I cannot convince him to follow my way in this very important issue of mine, and if I cannot convince him to follow my way in this issue of Yemen, then there is a real threat that if he does become stable and becomes assured of his power, that he can simply discard me later or perhaps really assert himself on me, and my options to resist that are very limited. And that's why I need Israel. That's why I need Washington aboard on the like, in order to ensure that Saudi never muscles me or is able to impose something on me that I don't want to do, such as in the case of the Qatar reconciliation. I don't think MBZ is worried that the dynamics are changing, but he's worried about what the reconciliation demonstrated with regards to the potential that these dynamics could change if bin Salman decides to change his mind at a later date.
With a change in administration, do you see the U.S., because we've had promises of this from Mattis on down, are we going to finally stop supplying the Saudis and the UAE in this never-ending war in Yemen that has turned out to be a humanitarian disaster beyond anything that anybody can ever see? It's off the mainstream media, but it's been horrible. School buses getting blown up. I mean, it's just a horrible situation with people starving. Are we finally going to get the hell out of there?
Never. Money is what talks in Washington. Money is what governs policy in Washington, not necessarily principles. And I think given the huge lucrative contracts that are involved in the arms industry, it's very hard to see any president suddenly turning down billions of dollars for the U.S. economy for the sake of your passionate speech in favor of the Yemenis or in favor of the people of the region. That's the dark reality of U.S. foreign policy, which differs perhaps to the domestic policy, where perhaps it's a bit more caring and a bit more kinder in the way that it treats American citizens.
Thank you for your candor. Sami Hamdi, great to have you, man. Great to have you on. Best analysis you're going to find. Go to InsideArabia.com. Sami, senior correspondent. Thank you, Sami, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John.